Some academic Task 1 writing prompts include diagrams. These are usually images, pictures of a process of some kind from beginning to end. Let's look at how to approach these questions so that you can be successful on your diagram Task 1 questions. First, let's look at some keys to success. So the first one, your goal for your overview paragraph is to summarize the entire process. So to be able to look at the process that's included in the diagram and try to describe it in very general terms from beginning to end. We're going to look at how to do that in just a moment. So that's your first challenge. And you have to be able to find the key activities, the key actions or stages in the diagram in order to represent them in some kind of summary. Secondly, then, you're going to have to usually describe the sequence of events that you see in the diagram from beginning to end. Okay, you want to figure out how you can put words to the images that you see in the diagram image. So let's walk through an example of how to do that and to look at what you should consider as you're trying to fulfill these two steps here. First of all, let's focus on how to summarize the entire process. Here we've got a sample image that is like one that you would find in Task 1 for your diagram question. And we've got up at the top here a label. So this is a 3-sink dishwashing process. Okay, how to wash dishes with 3 sinks. I suppose this is something you would find maybe in a professional restaurant or something like that as a way of making sure the dishes are very clean. So we see the stages moving from left to right. It starts over here with these dirty dishes and it ends way over at the right with the drying rack and all these stages in between. So for your overview paragraph, you need to be able to describe what you see here and generally what's going on from beginning to end in this process. All right, now I always like to have you kind of take a minute or two to sort of look at these things and think about what you would say if you had to summarize the overall process. So if you like to, go ahead and pause your video now, take a close look at this diagram here, and think about if you had to write 2 or 3 sentences describing generally what this image shows, what would you say for it? Go ahead and pause your video now and think about it. Okay, so what did you say for this one? Well, obviously we have to say something related to the title, right? This 3-sink dishwashing process. And we have to give some indication of what goes on from the beginning to the end of this process here. So let's look at an example overview to see how one way you could try to represent the activity in this diagram with words. So here's one that says, the diagram shows a method of cleaning dishes using 3 sinks. Overall, any remaining food is first removed and discarded from the dirty kitchenware, which is then cleaned in 3 separate basins before being set out to dry. Okay, so notice a few things. In this one, we describe the whole process, right? So from removing food all the way out to setting out the dishes to dry. So there's some general description of the activity that's there. And the first sentence way at the top, so the diagram shows a method of cleaning dishes. Here we have just a very simple description of what the whole diagram is about. Your challenge, of course, is to paraphrase. Try to paraphrase as much language as you can from the image itself and from the question prompt. It's just the same as all of the other Task 1 and even Task 2 prompts you get where you have language in the prompt that you need to put in your own words. So some attempts at that here. We've got kitchenware is one paraphrase that we have. Basins is another, right? A basin is another word for a sink. Okay, and there are a few other words as you go through and compared to what's at the on the image, you'll notice some paraphrasing there as well. Okay, so a very general description of what's happening from beginning to end in our image. After we have our overview paragraph together, our general description, then we have to go through and describe the steps in the diagram you're looking at. Okay, now some IELTS Task 1 diagrams can be quite complicated, and there may be some details that you will choose to leave out because they seem like they're not as important as others. That's fine, but in general, you need to describe each step that you see. So you don't want to miss any steps in the process, whatever they're showing you. So from here, we need to have a description of everything from all the way from on the left where we have dirty dishes to the drying rack over on the right. Each stage in this needs a description, and we need to figure out a way to put what we see here into language. All right, so before we have some examples of that, let's talk about a couple of things to keep in mind. One good thing to try is to find a verb for each section of the image. What action do you notice going on in each stage, in each step of the process that you're looking at? You can really boost your score on these essay questions by finding really descriptive and accurate verbs to describe the actions that you see in the image. So focus on verbs. Think about, what verb really captures the action that I see going on in the image. Another piece of advice is that it's often best to use passive voice in this type of essay. You're describing a process. We usually don't know who is doing the action that you see in the image. It's not important who's doing it. It just describes a stage in a sequence of events. In order to put the focus on the action itself, on the activity, it's actually better, more descriptive to use passive voice constructions in your answers. In a moment, we'll look at some sample sentences and you'll notice the passive voice that we have there. As I'm sure you've studied before, the passive voice is created by using some form of the be verb, so am, is, are, was, were, plus a past participle verb. So an example would be something like a cookie was stolen from the cookie jar, right? That's passive voice. Was stolen. Stolen's the past participle form, and we have was, past tense of the be verb there. So that's the construction that works best for your diagram questions. That's mostly what you're going to want to use to describe the actions you see. Okay, lastly then, you need to avoid the trap of just writing activities, one after the other, actions in a simple list according to what you see in the diagram. You need to make sure you're using words and phrases that connect the activities together. So transition words like first, second, third, last, okay, those work well. You can also use phrases that sequence things together, like before the water is added to the second basin, it's heated to 75 degrees, something like that, okay? The phrases you use to show sequence and how those activities are connected together are a key to getting a really good score on your Task 1 essays that include diagrams. So focus on that. Now we're going to look at some sample sentences now for our sample diagram on dishwashing. If you want to see the full essay related to this diagram, look down below in the notes. The full essay is there. I'm just going to pull out a few sentences related to each of these steps that show some of the things that we need to be working on. Remember, we're looking for a good verb for each step in the process. We're going to use passive voice, and we're going to try to use transition words and phrases that show sequences of things so that we can connect the ideas together. So we've got our arrow here pointing to the part of the diagram we're looking at, and we'll look at some sentences that go through each stage here. All right, the first one, it begins down below. First, the dirty dishes are assembled and uneaten bits of leftover food are discarded in a compost bin. Okay, so that first step there, we've gathered the dirty dishes together and we've gotten rid of any food scraps. As it says on there, we've instead paraphrased that as uneaten bits. Notice the passive voice construction here, as we've discussed, are assembled, okay, and are discarded. The passive voice of both of these verbs. Okay, and our key verbs there that we're looking at, assembled and discarded, are two verbs that are very descriptive of what we see in this first part. Okay, the next one, we're moving on. So in the first sink, then, okay, there's our transition word. The cookware is cleaned in the first sink, which contains soapy water. All right, next, in the next step, the dishes are moved to a second basin. The water is heated, but does not contain any chemical additives. Okay, we know that the water's heated because we get that indication down here, but nothing like in the third basin. We've got this sort of bleach that's added here. And in the first basin, we have dishwashing detergent. So we see that in sink number 2, nothing like that is added. So that's notable for sink 2 and should be added to your description of what you see there. Right? Moving on then, the last sink contains water that's warm to at least 75 degrees. A cup of bleach is added to the third sink as well. Okay, more passive voice, more different verbs for each description of what we see there. Lastly, then, the dishes are placed on a rack to dry out. Okay, so from beginning to end, there's some sentences that pull out the major actions that you notice in each stage. Again, if you look down below, there's some detail added here so that we hit our word limit, but these are sample sentences to show you the grammar and the sequencing language that we need to get from beginning to end in this particular diagram. Okay, so to review, there are two main things to really focus on with these diagram questions. The first thing, we need to get our overview paragraph together, and to do that, we have to summarize the entire process. You need to sort of indicate what the diagram is about, and then from beginning to end, what does the diagram show? Okay, we saw an example of that for our dishwashing diagram. Then we need to go through and from beginning to end describe the stages, the steps involved. Okay, so you're supposed to, in this case, find a verb for each section of the image. So you have to describe each major part of the diagram. Again, some diagrams are very complicated. You might need to leave some small details out. That's okay. You have to decide if the detail's important or not, but you may not leave out any of the major steps in your description of the process. So find a verb, put that verb into passive voice to describe the action that you see, and then make sure you use transition words and phrases to avoid writing a simple list. You want to make sure that you are indicating the sequence of actions and how these activities relate to one another. These can be simple transition words or phrases that show how the actions connect together. All right, so that's a way to approach these diagram questions. And again, look at the example below if you want to see the full response for our dishwashing sample.